To go or not to go? Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Yes, Hamlet was quoted in the House of Commons today. Why? Because the Shadow Chancellor has questions to ask of Chancellor Rachel Reeves, if she will stay or if she will go. My name's Tom Harwood, and this is the GB News Originals series. Rachel Reeves addressed the House of Commons after days away from that front bench, having been to China to drum up business and try and counteract some of those market wobbles we've been seeing over the past 7 days. But did it work? Well, she was questioned over why she did not turn up in her place in the House of Commons last week to address the market wobbles as they began, as the cost of government debt began to rise, as the pound began to fall. Where was the Chancellor? An urgent question was brought before the House of Commons, and instead of turning up herself, she sent her deputy. Today we learn that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves was indeed in the country when that urgent question was brought before the House of Commons. But instead of choosing to come and face the music, she decided to send an underling, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to face that question instead. So it's been days upon days until we've had the chance to hear what the Chancellor thinks about her plan going belly up. Why has her plan gone belly up? Her entire shtick as Chancellor and as Shadow Chancellor was to be Mrs. Stability. Yes, Rachel Reeves, in the wake of the mini-budget under Liz Truss, said that Labour was the party that would deliver financial stability, that would deliver a lower cost of borrowing. However, what's happened in the last 7 days? Precisely the opposite. The value of the pound has fallen, and gilt yields, the amount the government has to pay to borrow money from the international markets, and given we borrow so much money, given our deficit is so large, it's really important how much we pay for our gilt yields, how much our gilts yield on those markets. Well, goodness me, it seems to be that things have not gone in the direction that the Chancellor would like. How far have things gone south? Well, since the budget, the amount the government has to pay just to service the debt of this country has risen to £12 billion. That's billion with a B. Yes, the government is now having to shell out 12 billion more than it previously thought it would, simply to service its own debt. So it didn't help that the Chancellor raised 20 billion extra borrowing this year in her budget. Indeed, by the final year of the forecast, it was 40 billion extra in borrowing. That's around 140 billion total over the course of this financial period extra in borrowing. We always talk about the tax of Rachel Reeves' first budget as Chancellor, but we never really talk about the borrowing. Of course, she changed the debt rule to allow her to borrow more. And borrow more she did, tens of billions more of borrowing, as well as tens of billions more in tax rises. The tax rises, of course, have pummeled business. The business group, the CBI, has been criticising the government for lumping all of the pain on business, and that seems to have dampened the growth rate. There's some analysis that suggests it's risen inflation too, as these businesses pass their higher costs onto those prices that you and I pay when we go to buy things. So what then happens? What happens next? Well, business has been pummeled, and what do we have to show for it? Well, more borrowing, not less borrowing. And when borrowing goes up, more money sloshes around the economy, inflation goes up, prices rise, and markets take a weary eye to look at the United Kingdom and think, goodness me, is this the safest place to place our money? And if the international markets think that the UK is no longer a very safe place to place that money, the cost of debt rises. And then the Chancellor has a horrible situation. How does she solve that 12 billion extra that she has to pay for debt interest that she didn't think that she'd have to pay for debt interest? Well, she can either make £12 billion of cuts or raise £12 billion more of spending. But it might not be £12 billion. We don't know how much higher these borrowing costs could go. The Chancellor, frankly, is in a bind, and she needs to find some economic growth. But if she tries to raise taxes to fill in this new black hole that the Chancellor has seemingly created in the country's budget, well, how on earth does that create growth? More taxes usually leads to lower growth. And growth at the end of the day is what Rachel Reeves has always said is the number one mission of this government. And yet the growth forecasts assessed by the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility are lower today than they were before the budget over the course of the period, the course of the forecast period. That growth forecast goes down, not up. Goodness me, where do we go from here? There was suggestion in the House of Commons today that there might be an emergency budget, perhaps a mini budget as soon as this spring. Could that really be the case, that not only do we have the annual autumn budgets that the Chancellor promised, but we have one every 6 months just to deal with the extra costs that have been piled upon the Treasury? It's a grim picture. But shall we see how the Chancellor responded to it in the House of Commons? Let's look first at what the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, had to say to Rachel Reeves.
Can I at the outset say it is good to see the Chancellor in her place and to thank her for advance sight of her statement. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Chancellor has been away, so let me update her on the mess that she left behind. The pound has hit a 14-month low. Government borrowing costs are at a 27-year high. Growth has been killed stone dead. Inflation is rising, impacting millions. Interest rates are staying higher for longer, and business confidence has fallen through the floor. The party opposite talked down the economy. They crippled businesses with colossal taxes, breaking all their promises. This is a crisis made in Downing Street. And Mr. Speaker, it should hardly surprise the Chancellor that international markets are uneasy. The UK's long-term borrowing costs have risen to their highest in almost 30 years. But while the government was losing control of the economy, Mr. Speaker, where was the Chancellor? Her trip to China had not even begun when my urgent question was taken in the House last week. She was still in the country, but she sent the Chief Secretary rather than face up to her own failures. So can I ask the Right Honourable Lady why she chose not to respond herself? Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor, of course, ducked the difficult questions by jetting off to Beijing. I believe that in Labour circles they are calling it the Peking duck, Mr. Speaker. Well, whatever was on the menu in China, was it really worth the unedifying sight of an increasingly desperate politician scampering halfway around the world with a begging bowl? Was it really worth it? The Chancellor's deal pales in comparison to Labour's black hole, which has opened up in the public finances while the Right Honourable Lady was absent from her station. To give a sense of scale, Mr. Speaker, the deal the Chancellor has announced amounts to £120 million per year. The rise in our borrowing costs due to her disastrous budget has added around £12 billion to our annual spending on debt interest alone. Literally 100 times what she says she has brought back from Beijing. That is money that cannot now go on the public's priorities. £12 billion is enough to pay for 300,000 nurses, to cover Labour's pernicious winter fuel payments cut for 8.5 years. And of course, even before this latest market reaction, the budget meant spending tens of billions more in servicing our debt. Terrible. According to the OBR forecast, 2/3 of the money raised from the Chancellor's jobs tax will be swallowed up by additional debt interest. Forget those billions going on better public services. They are going on paying the price of Labour's mismanagement. And we on this side know how this sorry story goes. We have seen it, Mr. Speaker. We have seen it all before. Socialist governments that think they can tax and spend their way to prosperity. Labour governments that simply do not understand that if you tax the living daylights out of business, you will get stagnation. They do not understand, Mr. Speaker, because there's barely a shred of business experience on the front bench opposite. And can I ask the Right Honourable Lady, which of her promises will she break if in March the OBR judge that she is now in breach of her own fiscal rules? Will she cancel promised spending? Will she ramp up borrowing? Or will she raise taxes yet again? Mr. Speaker, this whole sorry tale is nothing short of a Shakespearean tragedy, playing out before our eyes. This is the Hamlet of our time. They promised the electorate much while pouring the poison into their ear. At the end, you can feel the end. The Chancellor flailing, estranged it seems from those closest to her, those about her falling, the drums beating ever closer. To go or not to go, that is now a question. The Prime Minister will be damned if he does, but he will surely be damned if he does not. The British people deserve better.
Growth is the #1 mission of this Labour government, and to grow the economy we need to help great British businesses export around the world. That includes to China. Not engaging is simply not an option. Next week I will be meeting with business leaders, investors and entrepreneurs at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos to make the case that the UK is one of the best places in the world to invest. And in the coming weeks, I will be setting out further details of our plans to kickstart growth in the economy after 14 years of failure from the party opposite.
Goodness me, that was quite the back and forth in the House of Commons today. Let's be real though, the Chancellor looks likely that she'll stay in her post, not least because Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has tied his own political fortunes quite so tightly to those of Rachel Reeves. If Rachel Reeves is sacked, could Keir Starmer be soon after that? That's what we saw with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, her own Chancellor. So it looks likely that Rachel Reeves will stay in post. The Prime Minister has been saying that he will keep Rachel Reeves on. But given the financial uncertainty that this country faces, is that the wisest decision? And can the Chancellor pull things back? Can she find that ever so elusive growth? Or will it be a bit of a painful mini-budget that we approach in the coming months? There's a spending review. There's likely to be larger spending cuts than had been anticipated. And could there be tax rises further than those already announced by the Chancellor? It's a grim picture, and we're going to be keeping a beady eye on it here at GB News. So do remember to stay subscribed to the GB News YouTube channel to keep abreast of what on earth's going on with how Rachel Reeves is running the Treasury.